Hello, I'm Larry Wilson. Please join me for another 15-minute Bible study on the Jubilee calendar. Today is part 2 of number 6. Let's begin with a quick review from segment 1. In our previous study, we learned that God required Israel to observe new moon feasts. This requirement raises a question that is not explained in the Bible. How did ancient Israel determine the arrival of a new moon? In seminar number 310, we learned there are 2 ways to determine the arrival of a new moon. There is calculating the arrival of conjunction, and there is citing the first crescent, the first full crescent of a new moon. These 2 methods explain why 2 Passovers were celebrated during the week of Christ's death. According to the actions of Jesus, who observed Passover at the appointed time, a new month begins at conjunction. But a new moon at conjunction cannot be seen, because there is no light shining on the side of the moon that faces earth. So how did ancient Israel determine the arrival of conjunction? There are 2 solutions to this problem. First, the ancients knew that a lunar cycle takes approximately 29.5 days. Therefore, in general terms, 2 lunar cycles amounted to 59 days. 29.5 plus 29.5 equals 59 days. To keep new moon feasts properly aligned with conjunction, the Israelites simply alternated the length of their months. One month had 29 days, and the next had 30. And again, we see that 29 plus 30 equals 59 days. But orbital geometry tells us that a lunar cycle is actually 29.5305 days in length. And to keep monthly cycles aligned with lunar cycles, the ancients inserted a leap day as needed, usually about every 3rd year. A leap month occurred when a month became 30 days in length, when normally it should have been 29 days in length. The insertion of a leap day every 3rd year simply means 2 30-day months occurred back to back. Since the Jubilee calendar typically has 37 lunar cycles every 3 years, we can compare the length of 37 lunar cycles with scientific instruments and with the naked eye. So we want to do a little comparison to see how the actual numbers work out. Using telescopes and other instruments, we know that 37 lunar cycles amounts to 1,092.628 days, which is rounded up to 1,093 calendar days. We know that using the ancient method that a lunar cycle was about 29.5 days, this comes out to 1,091 days plus a leap day every 3rd year, which produces 1,093 calendar days. We see 1,093, 1,093. This is the naked eye version. This is the scientific method, and you'll notice they're slightly different, 0.50 versus 0.628. This difference between the scientific measurement and a naked eye amounts to about a 3-hour drift per 3 years. And this fractional amount of time was corrected as needed. I'll say more about this in the next segment. Here's a second method for calculating conjunction. Suppose a shepherd is camping out in a remote territory, taking care of his flock, like the shepherds when Jesus was born, when the angels came and told them the Savior had been born. So how could the shepherd determine when he should return home to attend the next new moon feast. Yes, he could carry a countdown calendar and scratch off the days, but he could also watch the moon. The number of days between sighting the last full crescent of a waning moon and sighting the first full crescent of a new moon is typically 5 days, and conjunction typically occurs on the 3rd day after sighting the last full crescent of a waning moon. Notice these photographs taken by Antonio Citadeo showing the various phases of the moon. You see, we began with the sighting of the first crescent. We go through the lunar phases, and here we see the last full crescent of a waning moon. And the distance between the waning moon and the new moon sighting the crescents is 5 days, and conjunction is right in the middle, the 3rd day. The bottom line, even though conjunction cannot be seen, there was no reason for a shepherd to miss an upcoming new moon feast. God does not require people to do things at appointed times if the timing cannot be determined. Okay, now that we've reviewed how the arrival of a new month was determined, we've looked at both methods, let's investigate the arrival and length of a Jubilee year. In order to start a new year, the Israelites had to watch and wait for the arrival of 2 things. First, Israel had to watch and wait for the arrival of the spring equinox. I'll say more about that in a moment. Second, Israel had to watch and wait for the first conjunction on or after the spring equinox to determine the arrival of New Year's Day. And the wait for New Year's Day could be as long as 29 days after the spring equinox. So let's suppose we're looking at the spring equinox. That's what the E represents on this timeline. And a new moon could be on or 1 day after the spring equinox. It could be a week later, 2 weeks later, even up to 29 days later. So the ancients had to wait for the first new moon on or after the spring equinox to begin a new year. Since equinoxes and new moons are not important in our calendar, and Caesar deliberately designed it this way, a few words about equinoxes and their relationship to God's calendar are necessary. The Bible does not explicitly mention the spring or autumn equinoxes. In fact, the Bible does not explicitly speak about a number of things that we would like to know, but we can piece many things together with the help of archaeology and recorded history. So what is an equinox? An equinox occurs when the orbit of the Earth aligns with the Sun so that the amount of darkness and the amount of daylight are essentially equal for 1 day. And this brings about the Latin word equinox, which means equal night. Because of orbital geometry, the amount of daylight and darkness changes every day. Therefore, the equinoxes are rather easy to determine because there is 12 hours of darkness and 12 hours of daylight. When an equinox occurred in ancient time, the ancients recorded the positions of certain stars and constellations so that they had fixed reference points in the sky. Thus, when using the stars or constellations for navigation to cross the Mediterranean Sea or the Arabian Desert, they could look at the heavens with simple instruments and determine their approximate location according to the amount of time that had elapsed since the last equinox. Because Israel's survival and economy was based on seasonal agriculture, living from growing season to growing season was a matter of life and death. Plant crops on time and survive. Plant at the wrong time and face starvation. The spring equinox marked the beginning of spring, and the fall equinox marked the beginning of autumn. And now that we understand how and when New Year's Day arrived, we need to investigate one more matter. A year in the Jubilee calendar can be 354 days or 384 days in length. You might say, well, how is this variance possible? Well, the length of a given year in the Jubilee calendar depends on the number of new moons that occurs between spring equinoxes. This number can be 12, or yes, even 13. Here's the problem. 12 lunar cycles, that is 29.5 times 12, equals 354 calendar days. But the distance between spring equinoxes is 365.25 days, a difference of about 11.25 days. So this means that every third year, 13 new moons will occur between spring equinoxes, and that brings us to 384 calendar days. A typical 3-year cycle in the Jubilee calendar looks like this. Year 1 has 12 lunar cycles, 354 days. Year 2 has 12 lunar cycles, 354 days. And Year 3 has 13 lunar cycles of 384 days. So when we add it up, 37 lunar cycles plus 1 leap day brings us to 1,093 days. Using scientific instruments, we know there are 1,093 days in 37 lunar cycles. So we can do 29.5305 times 37 lunar cycles, and we round that up to 1,093 calendar days. Because the length of a year in God's Jubilee calendar can vary 30 days, the ancients also used a solar clock to give their civil year a fixed length of 360 days. This solar clock began with the spring equinox and ended at the following spring equinox. A fixed-length year was desirable for business, banking, computing taxes, making and paying loans, and civil administration. Doing business with lunar cycles was not practical. Therefore, a fixed-length year, which had 12 months of 30 days, was used. Ancient Israel used a religious calendar and a civil calendar. We do something similar today. For example, our calendar year begins in January 1, but our school year of 9 months begins in August. So we use 2 calendars each year as well. And you need to remember the Egyptians used a civil calendar having 12 months of 30 days before the Exodus took place. Scholars and pastors are divided as to how, when, or where the Jews created a 360-day year. But I conclude the solution came out of Egypt with the Israelites at the Exodus. Why do I say this? Archaeology tells us the Egyptians, prior to the Exodus, were excellent astronomers and mathematicians, and it is reasonable to assume that Moses, who lived as Pharaoh's son for 40 years, was highly trained in Egyptian science. So how did ancient Israel determine a fixed number of days for their civil year, since God's year varies between 354 and 384 days? Well, the answer is found in a solar clock called the Analemma. Archaeology says shadow clocks and sundials were used in Egypt before the Exodus. Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that Moses was acquainted with these devices. A sundial was used by the Egyptians to divide daylight into segments of time. The division of daylight was based on the rules of mathematical geometry, which the Egyptians perfected long before the Exodus. Although the Bible does not say this, it is reasonable to conclude that the ancient Israelites also used Analemma clocks. As you are about to see, this is the simplest of all shadow clocks. The Analemma clock is nothing more than a stick which has been poked into the ground in a vertical position. There is no sundial on top of the pedestal. In fact, this stick is called in the Greek language analemma, which means the pedestal of a sundial, because there is no sundial on it. Notice how it works. Suppose you want to create a shadow clock. So you drive a stick into the ground so that the stick is standing vertical, about 4 feet tall. You know the sun will cast a distinct shadow at noon on a clear day. Suppose you have collected and prepared 13 smooth rocks, about the size of an egg, and you have written the numbers 1 through 13 on them. Okay, at the spring equinox, you start your shadow clock by placing rock labeled number 1 at the end of the sun's shadow on the ground. And let's suppose you faithfully go through this exercise every 4th Sunday at high noon for a year. At the end of a year, you will have a set of 13 stones on the ground that look roughly like a skinny number 8. This figure 8 design is called an analemma because it is caused by the pedestal of a sundial. But wait, we're not through. Suppose you come back to visit your shadow clock a few weeks after the first year was completed. Looking at the shadow on the ground at high noon, and looking at the 13 stones you placed on the ground, you can roughly determine the number of weeks until the next equinox, or even the next season. Did you ever think a common stick could make such an amazing clock? If you were an ancient farmer, this simple shadow clock would tell you just how close the next season is. No guessing involved. But wait, as they say on television, there's more. The number of days between equinoxes is 182.62 days. But the ancients did not use this shadow clock to count days. Instead, they counted the number of degrees which the shadow traveled between equinoxes, which is 180 degrees. This means, looking at the seasons, that the summer and winter solstices, both which mark the beginning of summer and winter respectively, these are located at the 90-degree mark in our figure 8, that is, the very top and the very bottom. So depending on the longitude of this shadow clock, the shadow of the sun travels 180 degrees, that's the top half of the number 8, between spring and fall, and then from fall to spring, the sun travels another 180 degrees, which is the bottom half of the number 8. When the sun returns to the spring equinox, the sun's shadow will have traveled full circle 360 degrees. Because 360 degrees represented a year of 360 days, anyone in ancient Israel could take a stick, poke it in the ground, and build a shadow clock. Anyone could keep track of solar time with nothing more than a stick and a few rocks. Now that we've examined the need and use of a fixed calendar and the simplicity of the analemma, here's the punchline. The top half of the analemma plus the bottom half of the analemma make up a circle of 360 degrees, with each degree representing one day. A completed cycle of 360 degrees means the sun has gone through the 4 seasons one time. And this is why the phrase in Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 12:14, we read about a time, times, and half a time. This explains why this time period adds up to 1,260 days. 360 degrees, this is one time. A times is two times, and half a time is 180. When we add them up, we have 1,260 days. Archaeology and Scripture suggest this is how a fixed year of 360 days came to be used by Israel. Now, before we go, we're just about out of time, take a look at this time-lapse photo. This picture was taken by Anthony Ayamatis. You are looking at 47 time-lapse photos of the sun over the course of a year. Every 8th day at the same time each day, Anthony took a snapshot of the sun. Now pause this video if you want to study this picture for a couple of minutes. This is amazing photographic work. Well, I'm out of time. Please bookmark this video and share it with your friends, and continue to the next segment.